Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the chemistry notes on pages 9 through 19 for Biology 103 and 103 Hybrid. So just some basic terms. I used to teach chemistry for a while. Chemistry is fine. It's not as good as biology. Let's just be honest here. It supplements biology though. And the parts of chemistry that supplement biology are the parts that I do like. And thankfully, that's just really the basic parts. And if you understand the basics of chemistry, it helps a lot when we talk about water, properties of water, and when we talk about metabolism, energy availability. It is really useful. So you do need to understand these basic concepts. So let's get right into it. Chemistry, the definition, is the study of the composition, structure, properties, and interaction of matter. What is matter? Well, it has mass and takes up space. So if we think of anything, take a cube of aluminum, that would be matter. If you put it on a scale, it would have a weight. You could measure its weight, which is a measurement of mass, essentially. It's not the exact same thing, but higher mass will equal higher weight, just depends on what planet you're on. And a block of aluminum would take up space. So anything that has mass or weight and takes up space, we consider matter. And all of matter is composed of atoms. If you've taken a chemistry class or probably physical science in middle school, hopefully you talked about elements. On the periodic table you would see them: hydrogen, helium, lithium. All of those are elements. And an element just means a pure substance. It can't be broken down by chemical means into other substances. And some of the bulk elements that are going to be really important in life is SHNOPS. And one of the ways to remember that is that right there, that acronym, which is carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Those are the most common elements in living things and that are used for metabolism, energy storage, all of that good stuff. We think about fats, which we'll talk about. It's a lot of carbon and hydrogen. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acids, we're going to have a lot of nitrogen. Oxygen, obviously, is going to be important for cellular respiration. Don't know why I couldn't think of that. Phosphorus is also going to be important, and sulfur. So all of these are important in living things. There are trace elements, right? Magnesium, I take magnesium for migraines. Iodine has a lot to do with our thyroid and hormone systems, but those aren't present in high amounts. It's the SHNOPS or the SHNOPS that is very common. So we said that matter is composed of atoms. So what is an atom made of? And hopefully this is familiar to you, but an atom is just that smallest building block or smallest unit and the smallest possible piece of an element that still retains the characteristics of the element. And it's all determined by the number of protons. However many protons an atom has in its nucleus is going to determine what atom it is. So atoms basically have two parts. You have the nucleus, which has protons and neutrons, and then on the outside, flying around like a satellite orbiting the Earth, are the electrons. Protons are positive. They have a charge, we just say of +1, just because we determined that as a unit of 1. That doesn't mean it's 1 millivolt or anything like that. It's just that standard for comparison. We say protons are positive, +1, and they have a mass of 1. Neutrons, they have no charge. They're neutral, and their mass is also 1. Basically, a neutron is a proton that is neutral. Electrons, they have a negative charge. We say -1 charge, and they're so tiny. They do have a mass, but it's so small that we say it's negligible. So all of the space is basically going to be taken up by the nucleus. The nucleus has these large protons and neutrons with a lot of mass. And then on the outside, in what we might call the electron cloud, or the electron energy levels or shells, we have these tiny little electrons that are zooming around the nucleus insanely fast. And if you were to take a snapshot, multiple pictures of an atom, what they end up looking like, and you could just look up right now on Google, an atom of gold, and it's going to look like this blurry, foggy sphere because the electrons move so fast that you actually can't even see the nucleus. All you see is this cloud or this smudging from where these electrons are moving so fast. So overall, we say atoms are neutral because they should have, if it's just a standard atom, they should have an equal number of protons and electrons. Therefore, overall, they would have no charge. Even though the cloud is negative and the nucleus is positive, they have no net charge. It's going to have a net neutral charge. Hopefully this looks familiar. If not, that's all right. We're not going to be doing a ton of work with the periodic table, but you are going to have to be able to figure out, if I were to take just one of these off the periodic table, could you figure out how many protons, neutrons, and electrons that atom has? So this is for the atomic number. Is the top number is the atomic number, and the bottom number is the atomic mass. So we said that protons have a mass of 1, neutrons have a mass of 1. So the atomic mass, which is this bottom number, is going to be the sum of those protons and neutrons, because only the protons and the neutrons have a mass that's not negligible. The top number tells us the number of protons. But because we're assuming the atom is neutral, unless we're told otherwise, well, then the number of protons has to equal the number of electrons. So if we have 1 proton, then we also have 1 electron. To get the number of neutrons, well, the bottom number tells us the total mass. That's the sum of the protons and the neutrons. And you just round it to whatever the closest number is. So to get the number of neutrons, we know the top number is protons and electrons. Those values are equal. The bottom number is protons and neutrons. So if we want to know how many neutrons, we can just subtract those two numbers. So 1 minus 1 would give me 0, so the number of neutrons would be 0. Let's look at maybe nitrogen down here. Top number tells me protons and electrons, so it would have 7 protons, which are positive, and we would also have how many electrons? Well, they're equal to the number of protons, so it should be 7 electrons. To calculate the number of neutrons, we take the atomic mass and subtract it from the atomic number, or the number of protons. So 14, which is what that rounds to. 14 minus 7 gives me 7, so there would be 7 neutrons. So let's look at these examples. What is the atomic number and mass number for carbon, hydrogen, and potassium? Well, the atomic number is the top number. So for carbon, hydrogen, and potassium, the atomic number would be, we'll set these out, carbon, hydrogen, potassium. Atomic number is going to be, make a little table here. Atomic number is going to be for hydrogen, well, carbon first, top number is 6. Hydrogen, atomic number is 1. Potassium, atomic number is 19. Now the other one was the mass number, so that's just going to be the bottom number. So for carbon, that's going to be 12.001, we'll just round. Hydrogen is going to be 1.007. Potassium is going to be 39.098. What is the number of protons, electrons, and neutrons for carbon, hydrogen, and potassium? So let's set up another table here. And again, if you're taking the hybrid class, you can print off those student notes and fill them in as we go. You can print off the teacher notes and just listen and not have to fill them in if you learn better that way. Or if you're more just visual audio and you don't need to be writing anything, you don't like paper copies, then you can just listen to the videos and you can look at that later to supplement. So here we're getting protons, so we'll put P. Electrons, always do an E negative to denote electrons. And then we've got neutrons, so we'll do N. Alright, so first protons for carbon. Top number tells us the number of protons. So we've got for carbon, we're going to have 6. Hydrogen, we're going to have 1. Potassium would be 19. Electrons, unless they tell us otherwise, we always assume the electrons are equal to the number of protons. So carbon would be 6, hydrogen would be 1, potassium would be 19. To get neutrons, we take the mass minus the atomic number. So just mass number minus atomic number. So for carbon, I would do 12 minus 6. So the number of neutrons would be 6. Hydrogen, we can look up here, be 1 minus 1. It's going to give me 0. And then potassium, you've got 39 minus 19, which is going to give me 20. And then there are your answers. So what happens when something is different from what it might be on the periodic table? And those are called isotopes. So it's when you have atoms that have differing numbers of neutrons, but their protons are the same. Because what determines an atom is the number of protons. So here we've got hydrogen. You'll notice all 3 of these atoms have 1 proton. So that's what defines those atoms as hydrogen. If they had 2 protons each, they would all be helium. Whether they have 1, 2, or 1,000 neutrons, just the number of protons determines what atom or element that it is. So an isotope would be when you have different numbers of neutrons. If we look at this first atom, it doesn't have any neutrons. Second atom, it has 1 neutron. And then the third atom has 2 neutrons. And sometimes they'll have special names. So hydrogen, we have, this is just regular hydrogen like you'd have on the periodic table. If it has a neutron, then it's called deuterium. And if it has 2 neutrons, it's called tritium. And that's because the total mass of that nucleus would be 3, or tri for 3. So here's another example with carbon. This would be like regular carbon, like we just calculated off the periodic table. 6 protons, 6 neutrons. We do call that the nuclear number. And we call it the nuclear number is the summation of the protons and neutrons, because that is what the total mass value for the nucleus is. So the nuclear number and the atomic mass would be essentially the same thing. Carbon-13, it's got 6 protons and 7 neutrons. So when you add those together, the nuclear number is 13. And then carbon-14, you got 6 protons and 8 neutrons. We add those together and we get 14. A lot of times what will happen is, or what always happens, the more neutrons we add, the heavier the element gets with these isotopes. As they get heavier and heavier, they also get more radioactive. And that radioactivity has some pretty cool properties. Or you could call it instability. They become more unstable, which just means they're ready to break down into something else. And when they do that, right, we just looked at carbon-14. It's got 2 extra neutrons from carbon-12. That's why its mass is 14. That's why it's called carbon-14. So when carbon-14 breaks down into carbon-12, well, it just lost 2 neutrons. And when those neutrons are released, it's also going to release a lot of energy. And that energy is in the form of what we call radiation. The rate of their decay is measured using what's called half-life. So half-life would be how long it takes for 50% or half of an atom to break down into its daughter element, is what they might call it. So C14 is the parent element, and how long it takes for half of the C14 molecules to break down, or the C14 atoms to break down to C12, the time it takes for half of those to break down will be called its C14's half-life. And for carbon-14, which is used for carbon dating, the half-life of that is about 5,700 years, if I'm remembering correctly. So what can radiation be used for, or these radioactive isotopes? They can be used to kill, microorganisms or bacteria. It can be used for tracers, so PET scans, radiometric dating. We talked about that with carbon dating. Cancer therapy, so for killing cancer cells, they use cobalt-60, iodine-131. So as those elements decay, they release radiation that can kill cancer cells. Now, what happens if there's variation from what you see on the periodic table? So all the periodic table elements are written as neutral. But out in the environment, not every atom is going to be neutral. Some have a charge. If they have a charge, we call those ions. So to create charge, an atom has to either lose or gain an electron. If it gains an electron, it's going to become negative. Electrons are negative. you think of a neutral atom gains a negative particle, now it has a net negative charge. And we call those negative atoms or molecules, we call those anions. If it loses an electron, so an electron escapes, well then it's going to be positive because now it has more protons than it has electrons. And we call those atoms that are positive, we call them cations. So here's just a visual representation of that. We see here in the nucleus, how many protons does it have? Well, it has 4 protons, and it only has 3 electrons. So what's its charge? You got one more positive particle, so it's going to have a net +1 charge. It's got more positive particles, subatomic particles. And that would be a cation because it's overall positive. An anion here, you'll notice they have 5 electrons and only 4 protons in the nucleus. So the net charge would be -1. And we would call that an anion because it has a negative charge. Now, what's going to determine how reactive an atom is? Or how much does that atom want to interact or react with surrounding atoms? And that's going to be based on how many electrons it has in what's called its valence shell. So the valence shell, you see this outer blue shell here, or electron ring. That is the valence shell, or the outermost area where electrons exist. Electrons around atoms, it doesn't actually look like perfect circles. It's more like a sphere. Or if you really got into AP chemistry, there's like the dumbbell shapes and like the infinity symbol and a whole bunch of complex shapes. After that, you don't have to worry about that. You just need to know that electrons are in different areas, and we can call them rings or shells, working their way from closest to farther away from the nucleus, which is where we have, remember, our protons and neutrons. So if we look just at that outer shell, however many electrons it has out there is going to determine how reactive it is. One of the rules that we'll see with almost every atom on the periodic table, hydrogen's an exception, helium's an exception, but most atoms on the periodic table, they want to have 8 valence electrons. If they have 8 valence electrons, then we could say they're happy or they're stable. They're non-reactive at that point. They don't want to react with anything else because they already have 8 valence electrons. And this atom looks like it does 8. So this atom's happy. It's stable. Now let's say we took away one of these electrons. Well, now this atom would have 7 valence electrons. And it wants 8 valence electrons. So how many more does it want? It wants to gain 1 more electron to be stable. So it's probably going to interact with one other atom in order to find a way to gain that electron that it wants. It's kind of like if you it's just completely natural, it's automatic. If you roll a ball up a hill, gravity wants to bring that ball down the hill. It's the same thing with these atoms. If it doesn't have 8 valence electrons, it naturally just wants to gain it. It's like a magnet. It's got to have 8. So it's going to, when it runs into another atom, it's going to react or interact so it can get 8 valence electrons. And you'll notice at the image you have 2 in the first ring of electrons. Second has 8, and the third has 8 as well. So the one you're looking at, the first ring is the only one, and this is why hydrogen and helium only need 2. If the atom only has 1 electron energy level, then it only needs 2 electrons to be stable. But once you go past that to atoms, past that first row on the periodic table, they all have at least 2 rows or 2 energy rings. So they're all going to want essentially 8 valence electrons. So atoms that are non-reactive would be those that already have 8 valence electrons, or if it's hydrogen or helium, if it already has 2 valence electrons. So if it already has a full valence, we're going to say it's non-reactive. Example, argon, all the noble gases, right? Helium has 2, argon and everything else all the way down has 8 in its valence shell. So all of those noble gases are non-reactive. If an atom does not have a full valence shell, then it is reactive. This means it forms bonds with other atoms in order to fill its valence shell. That's why they're reacting. So for example, oxygen, it has 6 electrons in its valence shell, so it wants to form bonds to fill its valence shell. So here we see 3, 4, 5, 6. So it wants to gain 2 more. One way it could gain another electron is it could share electrons with a couple of hydrogen atoms. So a hydrogen atom, hydrogen has 1 valence electron. So it already has 1 in its energy ring, but hydrogen wants 2. Oxygen has 6, but it wants 8. So what they could do is they could actually share these 2 electrons, and now oxygen would have 7 if it shares this one with hydrogen. So now oxygen has 7, and hydrogen would have 2 because it shares both of these. Well, oxygen wants 8, so it still needs 1 more. So another hydrogen atom with 1 valence electron could share that electron with oxygen, and then oxygen in return could share this electron that it has right here with the hydrogen. So then now hydrogen gets 2 because it's sharing these 2, and then oxygen now has 8 because it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So oxygen shares 2, hydrogen share 1 each. So now oxygen has 8, each hydrogen has 2, and everybody's happy, or everybody's stable. So here's a question for you. Which of the following is a reactive atom and which is a non-reactive atom? All we need to do is look at the valence shell of electrons. Atom on the left, carbon. How many valence shell electrons does it have? And again, that's the outermost. 1, 2, 3, 4. It only has 4. How many does it want? It wants 8. So is it reactive or non-reactive? We're going to say it's reactive, right? It wants 8 and it doesn't have 8, so it's going to react with other atoms until it gets 8. Let's look at our other atom here. We've got neon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It has 8. The octet rule is satisfied, so we're going to say it's non-reactive. So what kind of bonds are used to satisfy these octet rules? One of them is called an ionic bond. An ionic bond is formed when atoms gain or lose electrons. A transfer takes place. It's a transfer of electrons, not a sharing of electrons like we just looked at. This makes one atom positive and the other negative, in which case they become attracted to each other. So for example, sodium only has 1 valence electron normally. Well, it's going to be really hard for sodium to gain 7 electrons, so it's a lot easier, requires a lot less energy. In fact, it just naturally happens. It requires no energy. It just releases. It's easier for it to just release this electron than it is to gain 7. Chlorine has 7. So it's easier for chlorine to gain 1 than to lose all 7. So chlorine naturally wants to gain an electron. Sodium likes to lose an electron. Well, if sodium and chlorine are close to each other, sodium can give that electron to chlorine. Chlorine now has 8 in its valence shell, so it becomes stable. And sodium lost the only one it had on its third energy ring. So that third energy ring, once it loses that electron, goes away. And now in its second energy ring, it has 8. So now sodium is stable. But because sodium lost an electron, and it was neutral to begin with, well, it lost a negative particle. So now sodium's going to be positive. Chlorine was neutral, but it gained a negative particle, gained an electron. So now chlorine is going to be negative. So it results in a cation, right? Sodium's positive now, and an anion. Chlorine is negative now. And what do we know about opposites? Well, oppositely charged particles are attracted to each other. So now there's a strong attraction between sodium and chlorine. And ionic bonds are extremely strong. If we're looking at sodium chloride, right, table salt, or salt, has a melting point. I believe it's 800 degrees Celsius, if I'm remembering that correctly. So you'd have to get it really, 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 really hot before you're ever going to melt salt. And the other type is what we showed with that hydrogen and oxygen, and this is a much better diagram of that to show you. This is when electrons are shared. So these are the strongest of the bonds. More electrons equals stronger bonds. And you think, well, water, I can boil water pretty easily. Yeah, you can boil water, but when you boil water, you're separating entire water molecules from each other. You're not breaking these covalent bonds. That requires an insane amount of heat and energy. So what's actually happening with oxygen and hydrogen here? With the covalent bonds, those electrons are being shared. So oxygen, you see it has 6, it needs 8. So if it can share 2 electrons or borrow those from hydrogen, then oxygen can have 8. Hydrogen only needs 2 because it only has 1 energy ring. Well, then hydrogen just needs to borrow 1. So it shares 1, borrows 1, or you could just say they share 2. And that gives hydrogen 2, so it's stable. Each hydrogen is doing that, so each hydrogen is stable. And then oxygen is sharing those, so it has 8, and it's stable. So everybody's stable. And that's why water just naturally occurs. And this is why you don't see even hydrogen gas is H2. Hydrogen gas is not just a lone, hydrogen atom floating around. It's 2 hydrogens put together. In nature, you don't see just free ions really just floating around. They're usually being combined with other things because they're reacting until they become stable. H2, because it shares 2 electrons, is now stable. So you're way more likely to find this floating around, which we have in the atmosphere right now, than you are going to find just a lonely hydrogen, because that thing is ready to react with something. Ammonia is another example over here of covalent bonding or sharing of electrons. You'll see nitrogen has 5 valence shell electrons, so it needs to gain 3. So it can form 3 bonds, covalent bonds with hydrogen. So it can gain those 3, so it ends up with 8, and then each hydrogen shares 2, so they end up with 2, which is stable for hydrogen. So everything's stable. It's going to either satisfy that octet rule, or if it only has 1 energy ring, it only needs 2 electrons. What are ways we can represent these covalent bond types? You'll see you'll see in your notes, these lines or dots. If it is a line, if it's just 1 line, that represents 2 electrons being shared, and we call that a single bond. So a single bond, the reason it's called single is because it's 1 pair of electrons. So it's actually 2 electrons. If we look at a double bond, that's 2 pairs of electrons, and you'll see we represent that with 2 lines. So it could either be 4 dots or 2 lines, or we might call it a double bond, or it might be said, if it's written out as a word problem, 2 pairs of electrons are shared. If we're talking about a triple bond, then it's 3 pairs of electrons, which will be 6 electrons, or we could draw 3 lines to represent it. Which one of these 3 bonds do you think is the strongest? By far, triple bonds, the more electrons are shared, the stronger that positive attraction between the nuclei of each atom and the electrons that are being shared. So it gets stronger and stronger as we increase what's called bond number, or what we might call bond order. Bond order of 3 is much stronger. And if you've taken chemistry or AP chemistry, this is all going to be very redundant for you. If you haven't, you're probably going to need to watch this again or study some of those notes. Sometimes the sharing of those electrons is unequal. If it's unequal sharing, we call that a polar covalent bond. Polar means different or unequal. Covalent still means a sharing. So it's an unequal sharing bond, an unequal sharing of electrons bond, polar covalent bond. The electrons will spend more time around one atom than the others. So this picture up top, you'll see we have just generic atom AB. The electrons that are being shared are closer to this nuclei of atom B. So it's polar covalent. It's an unequal sharing. The atoms are spending more time around atom B than they are around atom A. Whichever side the electrons are spending more time on is going to become negative, and the side that doesn't have as many electrons or isn't as electronegative. Electronegative just means how bad does that atom want the electrons. Atom A clearly does not want the electrons as bad as atom B, so atom A is going to end up being positive. So you end up with a difference in charge across the molecule from positive to negative. Sometimes they'll draw a little arrow in a diagram to show you how that charge is changing. So from this side of the molecule, it's positive, and it becomes, you point the arrow towards what's becoming more, what side of the molecule is more negative. Really the main reason, the course of study wants you to understand this in the college is because of water, especially in biology. Water, we're going to talk about more about that in a second with metabolism, but it's super important for regulating our temperature in our bodies. It's important for dissolving minerals and nutrients so we can actually absorb them into our cells. So it's super important for water, and even like how ice freezes and all kinds of stuff like that, which we'll get into. But with water has a polar covalent bond because oxygen is more electronegative. It has more protons in its nucleus, so it wants to pull in more electrons because there's more positive charge. So that strong positive charge on the inside of oxygen attracts the electrons of hydrogen, of its two hydrogens, more than the hydrogens attract those electrons. So we say oxygen is more electronegative. It wants the electrons more. So because the electrons spend more time around the oxygen atom within the molecule, oxygen ends up having, I need to erase that because that's kind of misleading. I'm just showing you that inside of the oxygen atom is a positive nucleus. But the point being is, because oxygen is more electronegative, it pulls in the electrons more closely, which gives the oxygen atom a slightly negative charge. Well, since the hydrogens aren't holding those electrons as close to it, the hydrogens become positive. We say it's a partial positive. Well, now water has one side of the molecule that's negative and one side of the molecule that's positive. So it is polar. Or you might have heard the word, if you're taking chemistry, a dipole. So it's polar covalent. It's still sharing electrons, so it's a covalent, but it's an unequal sharing of electrons. So it's polar covalent. If it's a nonpolar covalent type of bond, then the electrons are being shared either equally or there's no difference in charge across the molecule. Or the difference in charge could be so small that it's negligible. So for example, CO2, even though carbon is maybe more electronegative, or maybe oxygen's a little more, I think oxygen's a little more electronegative than carbon, it doesn't really matter because the shape of the molecule, right? We saw with water, it has this bent shape. So what happens because of that is that negative charge is exposed. So this negative charge can go and interact with other atoms or molecules, and this positive charge can go and interact with other probably negative atoms or molecules. So because of its shape, that difference in charge makes it reactive, and it wants to dissolve minerals and interact with things. But with CO2, it has this linear shape, so there's no exposed charge around the molecule. So even if the oxygens are slightly more negative and the carbon slightly more positive, that difference is small for one thing. And because the molecule is linear, the only thing that's exposed is negative charge, not a difference in charge. So it's going to be very unlikely to react with other atoms. So because of water's bent shape, and because it has a partial negative on the oxygen and the hydrogens are partially positive, it causes it to interact with other atoms in special ways. Now, if it's interacting with another water molecule, it can create something called a hydrogen bond. This is a relatively weak bond that is formed between two molecules. The rule for a hydrogen bond is you have to have hydrogen, and it has to be connected to nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine in one molecule, and then it has to be connected to another molecule with one of those same three atoms. So for example, here, this water molecule has a hydrogen and oxygen. So it satisfies, it could form an H bond with another molecule. If we look at this other water molecule, well, it also has a hydrogen and oxygen. So that oxygen is negative, the hydrogen's positive. So that attraction between that positive and negative of the oxygen of one molecule with the hydrogen of another molecule, that is the H bond. So this is the H bond. They're easy to pick out if you just memorize HNOF. If I've got, okay, so I see hydrogen with an oxygen, okay, that's an H bond. And as long as it has a hydrogen with a nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine, it's going to be an H bond. So they're relatively weak. It's an attraction between a positive and a negative end of two different molecules. That's important. All right, this is not an H bond. Within that water molecule, that's not an H bond. That's a covalent bond where two electrons are being shared. Now, between these two different water molecules, that's the H bond. That attraction between two different water molecules of hydrogen with nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine. And this all results because of water's shape and polarity. It has a difference in charge, and it has that V shape that allows it to have one side positive, one side negative. So you have to have a asymmetry, right? It's not the same on both sides. And you have to have asymmetry, that's negative, asymmetry in charge. And if you have those two things, difference in charge, difference in shape, then you can have these types of attractions. And then, of course, you have to have HNOF. So what are some properties of water that result because of its unique shape? So one of those properties is called cohesion. So just like we saw there, water molecules being attracted to each other. That's called the cohesion of water. Just like if you say the basketball team is very cohesive, it means they work together, they stick together. So cohesion with water is that water molecules like to stick together. An example of cohesion is surface tension, and we'll look at a picture of that. That's the property of the surface of a liquid that allows it to resist an external force. So this might be where we see little water beetles that can run across the water. Because water is attracted to itself, the cohesion, it doesn't want to let anything break that bond between the water molecules. So these beetles don't exert enough force to actually break that surface tension. Another property of water is adhesion. Water molecules are attracted to other substances. An example of that would be capillary action. So capillary action is the movement of water within the spaces of a porous material due to the forces of adhesion, cohesion, and surface tension. So if you took some water and threw it on the wall, it sticks to the wall. If it clumps up strong enough, then the weight will overcome that adhesive force and it will slide down the wall. But tiny drops will just stick to the wall. That's adhesion. Water's attracted to it. Then we'll look at capillary action. But here's surface tension. Right? The beetle can literally walk on the water because its mass is so low that the weight and force it exerts on the water isn't strong enough to break those hydrogen bonds in the water molecules that's holding it together. So it can't break that cohesive force on the water molecules. We see that with the paper clip. You take a dropper of water and it forms that teardrop before it falls out. That's water wanting to come together. That's water's cohesion. It wants to stick to itself. And remember, that all comes down to the shape of water having those hydrogen bonds with other water molecules, that difference in charge, that positive to negative attraction. Capillary action, you could take, a test tube, or it needs to be something with an open end so there's no pressure, but some kind of straw. That'd be a good example. Put a straw in a cup of water, and a little bit of water is going to climb up that straw. Why does it do that? Well, the water is attracted to itself, so it stays together. And then the water is attracted to the straw, so it sticks to the straw. And it literally climbs up the straw because it's attracted to it. It would work a lot better with probably a glass straw than it would maybe a paper straw. The thinner the glass, the higher the water goes. Well, why is that the case? Probably still have the same amount of water in that column. It just goes higher when it's thinner because it can go higher before the weight of the water is in equilibrium with those adhesive forces. And then this is going to be really important, especially in Bio 104, when you get to the second semester of biology, when we start talking about botany and root systems and water moving up to the leaves. In this course, we will talk about photosynthesis. So you want to get water to the chloroplast in the photosynthesis. So we need to have a good way to get water to the leaves, capillary action, and a difference in pressure from more positive to more negative allows that water to be pulled up from root to shoot. So we have water available for those chloroplasts so they can do photosynthesis. So water is also a great solvent, which means it dissolves pretty much anything. And that's great because, we have a liquid circulatory system. So if we need to get salts, chlorine, potassium, it's great that we're based on water, because when we consume those minerals, they can just dissolve into our blood and we can absorb them, and then they can be pushed into our cells. So it allows us to consume nutrients. If we had some kind of gaseous circulatory system, we wouldn't even be able to do that. So when we talk about solutions, there are 3 terms you need to be familiar with: solvent, solute, and solution. The way I remember this is to think about what is being added to what. So if I was going to make a saltwater solution, I would take salt and I would add it to the water. Whatever I'm adding is the solute. So the salt is the solute because I'm adding it to the water. Whatever is receiving what's being added is the solvent, or the dissolving medium. So as long as you remember what's being added, what's being mixed in, that's the solute, and then what it's being added to is the solvent. And then, of course, when you mix 2 things, you get what's called a solution. So the solution is just the result of the solute plus the solvent. A couple other properties of water. So what property of water does this have to do with? It has to do with water being a universal solvent. It dissolves just about anything, which is super important for living things. Hydrophobic versus hydrophilic. So some substances, if they're going to dissolve in water, they need to like water. And we call those substances that like water hydrophilic. They like, or they're water loving. It describes substances that are attracted to water. They are water soluble, or it dissolves in water, and they're also described as polar. So if they have a difference in charge across the molecule, right, going back to our water shape, you're going to see me draw this all the time. If another molecule also has this asymmetry, so maybe we have something like this, well, that's also asymmetric, and it has a negative side of the molecule and a positive side. Water's asymmetric, negative side, positive side. Then they can form bonds with each other. And actually that negative will be attracted to the positive, and the negative, the nitrogen, will be attracted to the positive hydrogens. And you'll end up with a bond there. So NH3 will dissolve in water because it also has a difference in charge across the molecule. So hydrophilic molecules are polar. Molecules that are hydrophobic, if you have a phobia of something, you're scared of it. So hydrophobic molecules, they hate water, or they're scared of water, so they are not attracted to water. So these are usually going to be lipid-based, insoluble. So lipids are fats. They are non-charged, large molecules, usually hydrocarbons, and they're not going to be attracted to water, so they don't dissolve. Oil doesn't mix with water. So we say those molecules are nonpolar. If you pour oil into water, it's going to just create a layer on the top rather than actually mixing in. Phospholipid bilayer that surrounds all cells has a side of it that is scared of water, so it's hydrophobic, and the heads are attracted to water, hydrophilic. So these phospholipid units that make up the cell membranes of all cells, their heads will face the water on the outside of the cell, and then their tails face away from the water, and a second layer faces the water on the inside of the cell, and then their tails face away from the water because it's hydrophobic tails, and it creates this nonpolar membrane on the inside with a polar exterior and interior. So what are some other properties of water? Water has a high specific heat, and water has a high heat of vaporization. And all this means is high specific heat, water resists raising or lowering its temperature. It likes to maintain whatever temperature it's at, and it's hard to either increase that or decrease that temperature. Well, why is that important? for our bodies, once we get our bodies to an ideal temperature, it's easier to keep our blood at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit because so much of our blood is just water. It's hard for its temperature to change too much because water has a high specific heat, which is really good because it helps us maintain homeostasis, an ideal temperature. So that's really good. Water also has a high heat of vaporization. This is also beneficial because when we sweat, that liquid builds up on our skin, and then it can absorb a lot of heat from our bodies before the water will evaporate off of our skin, which creates a cooling effect. So when we sweat, we cover our bodies in water, and that water absorbs the heat from the inside of our body, and that causes us to cool down. So it's a way for us to maintain our body temperature as well through this high heat of vaporization. It requires a lot of heat to vaporize water. So we have Nadal here. You see the sweat just flying off his body. When you start working out, you start sweating. That's one of your body's ways of maintaining an ideal temperature, and that's because we have billions and billions of sweat glands that allow us to release that water. So there's an interesting paper that I was looking at when I was preparing this that said it was looking at E. coli cells, bacteria, and they found that 99.4% of their metabolites in E. coli is just purely water. So pretty much all of its metabolism is happening in water, regulated by water. And then this tiny little slither is where all of the other active molecules, ATP, glutamate, whatever, are dissolved in that water. So almost all of life's chemical reactions occur purely in water. Excuse me. So when people are looking for life on other planets, obviously the first thing, if there's no water, there's no life, as far as we can conceive of how life works. So we'll talk a little bit about acids and bases. We'll do a lab on this, a pH lab. So an acid is a substance, excuse me, that dissociates and releases hydrogen ions. The more hydrogen ions released, the more acidic it is. So an acid, we think of things that, you pour it on concrete and it just dissolves it away. You put a piece of metal in it and it just makes it disappear. Well, how does it do that? It's just any substance that has hydrogens. Those hydrogens can be released, which creates a positively charged H+, that can wreak havoc on certain substances. Pretty much anything, but certain ones are more susceptible to those positive protons or those hydrogen atoms than are other molecules. So an acid is just something that donates those H+. A base is something that releases OH negative. So if it's a substance that has OH, it's a base. The more OH it releases, the stronger or more basic that molecule is. When we talk about bases, we'll also use the term alkalinity or alkaline. You've probably heard of alkaline water. It's water with a high pH or a basic pH. And they release OH negative. So base, when you think base, think OH. Acid, think H. So last thing I believe is pH scale and buffers. So the pH scale, which is what we'll be using when we do our pH lab, it goes from 0 to 14. Technically, it actually can go into the negatives and past 14, but for our purposes, pretty much everything we're going to deal with everything we deal with will be between 0 and 14. When you're below 7, so from 7 to 0, we say is an acid. Well, anything below 7 to 0 is an acid. Anything above 7 to 14, we say is a base. And then at 7, we say that is neutral. So some common substances we might see: lemon juice, pH of 2, vinegar, pH of 2.5, wine 3.5, coffee. I drink a lot of coffee. Coffee about 4.5. Stomach acid, which is actually hydrochloric acid, is down here at pH of 1. The purpose of that stomach acid is not to actually break down your food. You're supposed to chew your food. But the stomach acid actually sanitizes and kills any bacteria that's on there, so that when it goes into your intestines, then all those enzymes and microorganisms can just focus on the minerals Some things that are basic, usually the example is soap or bleach, right? Bleach is super dangerous and it's a base. So just because it's a base doesn't mean it's safe. If it's a strong base, it's just as dangerous as, a strong acid could be. The pH scale is a logarithmic scale, which means each unit represents 10 times the change in strength. So, for example, if I have something that is a pH of 2, and I want to compare that to something that's a pH of 1, how much stronger is a pH of 1? Let's say that's stomach acid. And a pH of 2, let's say that's soda. How much stronger is stomach acid than soda? It's 10 times stronger. Let's say a pH of 3 is orange juice. How much stronger is stomach acid than orange juice? Well, soda is 10 times stronger than orange juice. Stomach acid is 10 times stronger than soda. So the difference in stomach acid to orange juice would actually be 100 times stronger. Let's say a pH of 4 is lime juice. How much stronger is stomach acid than lime juice? It would actually be 1,000 times stronger. So a logarithmic scale, each number represents a factor of 10. If you were going from 0 to 7, I guess that would be, 1,000,000 times stronger. So when we use acids in the lab, a pH of 2 is a lot different than a pH of 1. Example, vinegar, a pH of 3 is 100 times stronger than black coffee, a pH of 5. So you just look at the difference in numbers and know each number represents 10. So however many spaces you go is just 10 times 10 times 10, however many places you move. Last thing is a buffer. If we just drank a bunch of soda and our pH dropped to 2.5, if our blood got to a pH of 2.5 and that was sustained for a long period of time, we would actually die because all of our proteins would denature at that pH and we couldn't move oxygen to our brain and our brain would shut down and we would die. Thankfully, our bodies have a solution to this, and it's called a buffer. Buffers resist changes in pH. They're composed of a weak acid and a weak base. What that allows it to do is it can either absorb H+, right? If it needs to become more basic, it can absorb H+ and move this way. But if it needs to become more acidic, then it can go this way and release more H+. Our bodies want to maintain a pH depending on what part of our body. Our intestines are different because we're trying to sanitize the food that we eat and then dissolve it. But in our blood, we want to be a pH of about 7.4. And that's optimal for the enzymes and white blood cells that are in our blood and the antibodies and all that stuff. So different parts of your bodies are going to be different, but generally it's going to be about pH of 7.4. Without a blood buffer, the first thing you ate that was too acidic or too basic would kill you. So we have to have that to actually survive. And I believe that is it for today. Sorry that was a long one.